Today marks a somber day in our nation's history. 18 years ago, airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people.
Now, in recent years, activism on behalf of the firefighters, police officers, and witnesses to those attacks who have become sick from the toxins that were released from the wreckage has increased. Joining us to discuss the anniversary and the push to ensure people impacted by the attacks receive the health care that they need and deserve, Lila Nordstrom, a 9/11 survivor advocate. At the time of the attacks, she attended a high school that was just blocks away from the Twin Towers, and she joins us now via Skype. Lila, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you talk to us about your experience on that day and how it's impacted your life?
Absolutely. I was a senior in high school on 9/11 at a school that's about 3 blocks from the World Trade Center. And so on the day, we had just started school when the first plane hit. And so I was in a classroom overlooking the World Trade Center, and we kind of watched the whole event transpire while my teacher kept teaching, because there had actually been a bombing at the World Trade Center in '93 where they had not required the school to evacuate, so he assumed we wouldn't evacuate. So we basically watched until the first tower came down. He continued to teach that entire time, and then eventually they called for us to evacuate, and so we exited out of the north exit as the second tower collapsed, and a death cloud rushed towards our school.
Lila, how has it impacted your life and your health in the years afterwards?
Well, it's impacted my life quite a bit because I got involved in health advocacy around this issue a few years after the attacks. In 2006, when they linked James Zadroga's death to his exposures at the World Trade Center, that was the first responder whose death they officially linked to those attacks or to the aftermath of those attacks. I was graduating from college. I was looking at losing my health insurance. This was before the Affordable Care Act was passed, so you couldn't stay on your parents' plan until you were 26. And I kind of saw the connection between the experience that we had had on 9/11 and the exposures that we had had on 9/11, because Stuyvesant returned to Lower Manhattan on October 9th, so less than a month after the attacks. And I thought, you know, this is gonna hang over us for a while, and this is gonna start to affect my classmates' health. I was already asthmatic on 9/11. I developed a lot of the other most common 9/11 linked conditions in the ensuing years. So, you know, GERD and sinus issues, and of course, PTSD symptoms. And those are all things that you can treat at the World Trade Center Health Program, which is one of the programs that we fought for in Washington to get access for responders and community members for, you know, treatment for their conditions. But now the obstacle is that we have to raise awareness about access to these programs, because especially in the community, a lot of people don't realize that they could have 9/11 linked conditions and that there's treatment available for them.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at one point you were actually denied health insurance by all the major providers because of your experience there on 9/11, correct? What
Yes.
has it been like? I mean, what has your experience been like trying to get coverage for yourself and other survivors who were impacted by that day?
Well, one thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that, especially before the Affordable Care Act, it was legal in certain states to reject people on the basis of pre-existing conditions. And I happen to live in one of those states. I lived in California. And I think a lot of people don't realize there's an aspect of this issue that pertains to larger health policies. So the struggle to get treatment for 9/11 survivors, especially when we started that struggle, was especially vital because many of us were looking at being rejected from insurers on the basis of symptoms that we only had because of our exposures to 9/11. That's sort of one piece that was especially vital about the programs. But then there's a second piece as well, which is that especially in the survivor population and in the young adult survivor population, we're incredibly dispersed nationally. You know, we graduated from high school, we were all native New Yorkers, but we went to college and then we moved on with our lives. I moved to California. And so we were looking at getting care in states where they were not accustomed to seeing 9/11 survivors. And because of that, we're not familiar with how to treat a lot of 9/11 related conditions. And, you know, we're not aware of how to look for linkages between those conditions. And so the program sort of became doubly vital to us because it provided us access to care with specialists who were getting information from the World Trade Center Health Program about how to actually treat us appropriately.
So, Lila, you worked with John Stewart's group and you actually testified at that famous hearing. Tell us a bit about some of the work that he has done and then the success that you've all had in securing the funding that you deserved.
Yeah, he's been a really wonderful advocate over the years on this issue and has really helped raise awareness about it that I don't think would have existed without his advocacy. I know early on, he had a bunch of first responders on his show, and my parents just happened to be in the audience for that. And so that was kind of we just happened to be there at the moment that it all started. But I've been going down to Washington with both the responder advocates who were down there with us and also John Stewart for years at this point. It's been incredibly important to making sure that the issue gets coverage and to making sure that, the issue gets sustained coverage, because an issue like this often, people care about this on 9/11. They care about this when it's convenient. But as we had to go and remind people in Washington repeatedly, you can tweet never forget as many times as you want. But if you're willing to, stand in the way of health coverage or compensation for survivors and responders, then you have forgotten.
Yeah. Well, and Lila, what does our audience need to know about what fights remain? What are you still pushing for?
So in getting the funding for the VCF extended, we sort of dealt with the big obstacle that we had on the compensation side. But the health program is sort of it's an entity that has to keep evolving. So as research links new conditions to 9/11, we have to make sure that we can get those conditions added as covered conditions to this program. And then we also need to make sure that there are going to be enough slots for survivors coming up. The initial program had a cap on the number of people that could apply to it, and so we need to make sure that as need for the program grows, the number of slots in the program also grows, especially for community members who were not given the same sort of voice in the coverage, and therefore are sort of slow to figure out that they need and have access to these services and are likely to start accessing them in larger numbers in the years to come.
All right, Lila Nordstrom, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your advocacy, too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lila.
Of course, yeah, thanks for having me.
Coming up, a new Univision poll reveals Bernie could be messing with Texas' red state status. Also, is Wall Street terrified of Elizabeth Warren?
A new California law shifts California's rideshare gig economy to an employee-based model. That's good news for Uber and Lyft drivers. Team Rising is in-house to talk about all of that when Rising continues.